I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Longtime listeners of this show will know that we've been following John C. Bennett for quite some time. At least for the last few episodes, we've been highlighting his role within Mormonism and the role that his expose played in impacting the church and Nauvoo history. Throughout all of our examination of John C. Bennett, we've had this overarching theme that so much of it centered around polygamy, but we haven't taken so much time to attack the subject of polygamy head on. So in order to help me do that, I've invited on a very special guest for today. Johnny Stephenson is an independent researcher of Mormon history, has been studying it incessantly for 5 years, just like yours truly, and has a little bit of information to share with us about the subject of polygamy for today. So Johnny, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We have a lot to get through. I asked if you would come onto the show and really help me out in tackling this subject, and you sent me over 176 pages worth of notes for us to try and parse through. So I'm just going to kind of allow you to take this how you want. And the way that we're structuring this, we're breaking this up into two separate episodes. So how we're going to do this is we're going to study the practices of marriage and adultery as it was practiced in Ohio and in Missouri, and the posthumous or the post hoc labeling that has been applied to those affairs of polygamy. We're going to examine that all the way up into 1842 when John C. Bennett began publishing his exposés. Then part two is going to examine the practice of polygamy post-Bennett, because there is quite a sharp dividing line here. We're going to highlight some of the stories of the actual individual women as they were affiliated with polygamy and their roles in it, who their husbands were. Primarily, we're focusing on Joseph Smith, of course. But let's just get started early on. Johnny, you sent over a ton of information on pre-Mormon possible polygamy to the affairs of Eliza Winters, of possibly the Stowell daughters. Why don't we just pick it up there? Joseph Smith got married to Emma Hale in 1827, and now we have the ground set for us.
Sure. Well, I'm of the opinion that Joseph Smith just, was infatuated with women.
Okay.
He seemed to have problems with unchaste conversation, basically. The 1828 definition of that is basically lewd conduct. Unchaste meant one of the meanings of it was lewd, and conversation meant how you acted, not how you spoke. Today, the meaning of the word is kind of reversed. We speak of conversation as having a speaking between people. He wrote, during this time, as is common to most or all use, I fell into many vices and follies, but as my accusers are and have been forward to accuse me of being guilty of gross and outrageous violations of the peace and good order of the community, I take the occasion to remark that, though, as I have said above, it is common to most or all use, I fell into many vices and follies. I have not, neither can it be sustained in truth, been guilty of any wrongdoing or injuring any man or society of men. Well, that's true. He probably didn't injure any men or society of men. But he goes on to say that this being all and the worst that my accusers can substantiate against my moral character, I wish to add that it is not without a deep feeling of regret that I am thus called upon in answer to my own conscience to fulfill a duty I owe myself as well as to the cause of truth in making this public confession of my former uncircumspect walk and unchaste conversation, and more particularly as I often acted in violation of those holy precepts which I knew came from God. So when he speaks of unchaste conversation in that setting, it's really not the meaning of the word was how you acted, how he acted unchaste, not how he just spoke to people.
Right. It's much in the way that we view the word intercourse today as, a sexually explicit intercourse. But intercourse was so often used in the 19th century to just mean a conversation that you're having with somebody, or walking down the street and chatting with someone. So there are slight definitional differences that we need to understand in order to approach the 19th century terminology. But let me get this straight. So you're basically saying that from Joseph Smith's days, before even the church was founded, he was having these introspective issues that he saw as unchastity, and he was trying to wrestle with those.
I think that was part of Joseph Smith's makeup. Dan Vogel calls him, what is it, a pious...
pious fraud?
A pious fraud.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think that Joseph was complex. I think he wrestled with the fact that he had issues. In Nauvoo, he once said that I don't want you to think that I'm very righteous, because I'm not. These are things that he would let people know about, that, I have these problems. For example, he would do things, he would confess to it, try to repent, and then, move on. He did this over and over again. We have many examples of how Joseph felt bad about things that he did, and confessed it. He confessed it, we'll get into it later, but in the 1843 Revelation, there's all kinds of stuff about how he had transgressed and was forgiven for his sins. That's basically a repeat of what's going on here. He had committed some sins in his that he felt were sins in his youth. He said he had violated holy precepts. So I think that Joseph had a problem, maybe he thought, with how he interacted with women and the desires that he had. And I think that he wrestled with trying to religiously justify that for his entire life.
Well, let's approach this through the lens of the Stowell daughters and Eliza Winters, because Eliza Winters was supposedly a friend of Emma Hale, Emma Smith, as she later came to be. And the Stowell daughters, this is something that happened in the, less than a year after the church was started, but they do seem to be somehow representative or almost harbingers of how the church would be practiced from then forward. So what is kind of your general take on the Stowell daughters and Eliza Winters?
Well, there isn't much to go on in terms of the Stowell daughters. The Mormon apologists have made that perfectly clear, that there's nothing there. But there is something there, because otherwise, why would they have been brought to court in 1830 to testify? And it could have been about something unrelated to women. But that doesn't seem likely to me, because what Joseph would do and what his method of operation was he would have relationships with people that were close to his wife or were in his home. He did this consistently throughout his entire career. Yeah. So Eliza Winters was a friend of his wife, and the Stowell girls were, family friends. Josiah Stowell helped him get married to Emma. I think that they stayed at his house, or they met at his house. Then they went to the Justice of the Peace, and they came back there. And he was his employer, and he had these two daughters. And so maybe Joseph had an interest in them, and it got noised about. Maybe it was just local, so it wasn't repeated. Emma wouldn't probably have repeated it. And, and some of the local people had found out about it. And then when they tried to retry him on the glass looking in 1830, they brought them in to try to destroy his character.
Yeah.
And there may have had nothing going on. We just don't know. So, I mean, there's just a question mark there for those two.
So let's go ahead and move a little bit forward, because once he gets out to Ohio era of Mormonism, we have a couple of instances that we can point to unequivocally that we know something probably happened. And of course, I speak resoundingly of Fanny Alger. That is kind of one of the mainstays that a lot of historians bicker about is Fanny Alger, but there's also the possible Nancy Miranda Johnson Hyde, well, not Hyde at the time, a funny business in Hiram, Ohio as well. And what I think both of these instances do is establish that there may be a bit of a pattern here moving up into the mid-1830s. So,
can I interrupt?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Eliza Winters, if that's okay.
Please do, yeah.
This is still New York. And in that time frame where they moved down to Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, this Eliza Winters woman comes up, and she was a friend of Emma's, and we have some strange things going on with this. Emma's cousins, Levi Lewis, one of them, they were Levi and Hyle Lewis. They made an affidavit in the early 1830s, which stated that he had been acquainted with Joseph Smith Jr. and Martin Harris, and that he has heard them both say adultery was no crime. Now, this is an interesting accusation because there's things that went on in Ohio that are going to make it important to note. And then he said, Harris said he did not blame Smith for Smith's attempt to seduce Eliza Winters. Mr. Lewis states that he knows Smith to be a liar. He saw him intoxicated, and there's a couple of other things there. So what's interesting is that in Ohio, Martin Harris said that he saw Joseph intoxicated when he was translating the Book of Mormon. He retracted that. But there's some verification to what Lewis stated. But the other thing is that Levi Lewis is speaking about, Martin Harris saying that there was that Joseph Smith didn't do anything wrong when he tried to seduce Eliza Winters. So we have an accusation here of Joseph Smith trying to seduce one of Emma's friends. So what makes this interesting is that in 1833, Martin Harris's brother Emer said that the 24th of last January, Brother Martin was taken a prisoner for on a false charge of slander. He went to prison a few days until we got bail to answer to the court the last Monday in April, or we should probably have been to the Ohio before this time. But now it is put over until the next September. Therefore, we shall take up our journey westward ere long to go as the Lord shall direct until we arrive in the Ohio. Now, what had happened is that Martin Harris was at a church meeting, and Eliza Winters was also there. And Martin Harris had stood up and accused her of having a bastard child. And so Eliza then sued Martin Harris for slander and got him in jail. What happened is she wound up losing the case because she couldn't prove slander. It was very hard for women to prove slander in that period of time.
Of course.
So we have that whole incident that took place, and one wonders why Martin Harris would do that, why he would get up and try to, slander this woman's character. And if you take into account what Levi Lewis said, that Joseph had tried to seduce her, then maybe you can understand why that happened.
I do find that
happened early on in Joseph's career.
Yeah, that's very early. And the simple fact that the Lewises did swear out this affidavit that Martin Harris, in concert with Joseph Smith, both thought that adultery was not a crime, that seems as if it's indicative of a mindset or a mentality that they were, maybe a little bit more progressive in their ideas, contrary to the Protestant ideas of sexuality and gender role and monogamy from a very early stage in Mormonism. And I'm just kind of trying to tease this apart in my mind, but that does reveal that there was some kind of counterculture cropping up in early Mormonism within even when Martin Harris was affiliated in the early 1830s. That people were noticing, people were taking note of, and that's worth pointing out.
And we have what's interesting is that we have in 1831 the man Ezra Booth, who joined the church, and then he went to Zion, down to Missouri with Joseph Smith, and his trip to Zion was not what he expected. And so when he got back, he got together with Simmons Ryder, and they kind of attacked the church and Joseph Smith in particular, and Ezra Booth wrote a series of letters explaining all of the things that he felt Joseph had done wrong. And he wrote two things that are interesting, and they play on this adultery theme that Levi Lewis explained in his affidavit. Ezra Booth wrote, now permit me to inquire, have you not, let me give you just a little bit of background on this. He wrote to Edward Partridge and a few other people, and he was explaining about Joseph Smith, and this is what he wrote. Now, permit me to inquire, have you not frequently observed in Joseph a want of sobriety, prudence, stability, which are the most prominent traits in the Christian character? And then he goes on to say, some suppose his weakness, nay, his wickedness, can form no reasonable objection to his revelations. And were he to get another man's wife and seek to kill her husband, it could be no reason why we should not believe revelations through him, for David did the same.
Oh, nice biblical justification for that. That's great. Okay.
And specifically David. And then in another letter on November 29th, the first letter was September 20th, 1831 to Edward Partridge. The second letter that he mentions this in is from November 29th, 1831. And he writes, there are also some other things, the meaning of which you will not be likely to apprehend without some explanation. In this, as well as several of the commandments, it is clearly and explicitly stated that the right of delivering written commandments and revelations belong exclusively to Smith, and no other person can interfere without being guilty of sacrilege. In this office, he is to stand until another is appointed in his place, and no other person can be appointed in his stead unless he falls through transgression. And in such a case, he himself is authorized to appoint his successor. But how is he to be detected should he become guilty of transgression? The commandment makes provision for this. His guilt will become manifest by his inability to utter any more revelations. And should he presume to get another man's wife and commit adultery, and by the shedding of innocent blood seek to kill her husband, if he retains the use of his tongue so as to be able to utter his jargon, he can continue as long as he pleases in the bed of adultery and wrap himself with garments stained with blood, shed by his own hands, and still retain the spotless innocence of the holiest among mortals, and must be continued in the office of revelator and head of the church. And then he had some others, especially Cowdery, have earnestly desired to relieve Smith of some part of his burden. So, he seemed to think that, others wanted to, be spokesman for the church, and Joseph felt threatened because he did give that revelation early on that he was to be the only person that could speak for the church. So we have these two mentions of adultery really being no crime, the same thing that Levi Lewis states by Ezra Booth, and this was 3 years earlier, before Levi Lewis made his affidavit in 1834. These were written in 1831.
Yeah, and let's be clear about qualifying the historicity of these documents, right? These are contemporary sources. They're written at the time. They're not later reminiscences that are secondhand accounts. These are Ezra Booth, a guy who was a member of the church very briefly in Kirtland era, began his mission, went out to Zion, realized that he was in over his head and that he didn't agree with the precepts and tenets of Mormonism, and then went on. He was one of the very first members who did an expose of Joseph Smith, and he published his letters publicly, and they're contemporary sources of Joseph Smith thinking that adultery was not a crime in 1831. I think that speaks volumes to the entire mentality of early Mormonism.
Yeah, and I did a little study on this. I really feel this is interesting too, because I did a little word search in the Book of Commandments, which had been published in 1833, 2 years later, and of course, these were revelations that were compiled over the last 5 years or so. And I looked up the word adultery, and the word adultery appears only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in the Book of Commandments. And but the dates for when it appears are interesting. The first is August 1831, right when Booth's writing his letters. August of 1831, thou shalt not commit adultery. February of 1831, but if a man shall commit adultery, he shall be tried before 2 elders of the church. February of 1831, but if you shall find any persons have left their companions for the sake of adultery, and they themselves are the offenders and their companions are living, they shall be cast out from among you. August 1831, neither commit adultery nor kill or anything like it. It's like a direct rebuttal to what Ezra Booth was writing. It says, August 1831, neither commit adultery nor kill or do anything like it.
Of course.
Because Ezra Booth had accused Joseph of committing adultery and that he could, kill somebody that had the husband of a wife, and he could be held blameless. So Joseph comes out and makes up some revelations that answers this. And then verse 18, he that looketh on a woman to lust after her, or if any shall commit adultery in their hearts, they shall not have the Spirit, but shall deny the faith and shall fear. And then there's one other revelation that mentioned adultery that was not printed in the Book of Commandments. And this was from 1830, but it was addressed to William McClellan. And it was later published in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I just noticed that all the above mentions of the word adultery are between February and August 1831, the period of time that Ezra Booth writes about. Mm-hmm. So we have, on the one hand, Joseph is going out of his way to include all these things about adultery in there, I think because there were accusations running around that he had said that adultery was no crime.
And let's use that same post hoc rationalization that apologists are often want to use when they're trying to apply a holy veneer to the practices of adultery and call it polygamy. There are later reminiscences from William Wines Phelps, I believe, that claim that when they explicitly asked Joseph how they were to take the Lamanites to wife when they're already married, Joseph said that it would take them the way that the biblical prophets did. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the crux of it. So you have this mission troop, Ezra Booth being one of the missionaries who went out to Missouri to preach to the Native Americans out there. And at this time, you have Ezra Booth, when he disaffected from the church, writing that there's adultery and that Joseph saw no crime in it, that he would kill another man in order to get his wife, the way Solomon did. And then we have this interesting little tidbit of revelation that adultery is that you should not commit adultery. These are all contemporary sources, and it's all coinciding with this mission troop out to preach to the Native Americans.
And when was that? That was July of 1831.
Yeah, right around the same time.
It is Jesus Christ's will that in time you should take unto you the wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity might become white, delightsome, and just, and even now their females are more virtuous than Gentiles. So we have this going on. Harris supposedly knew about this revelation, for Phelps stated that Harris was there when Smith gave it. The revelation is important to Mormons, for without it, later events that took place between Smith and certain women in Kirtland would have to be portrayed in a different light. So they say that Joseph Smith received the revelation on polygamy early on, and they used the date 1831. But this really has nothing to do with Smith's doctrine of sealing and all the things that went on in Nauvoo.
Right. Well, and there's a sharp divide, right? So we're eventually going to meander into into Nauvoo in 1840s here, because I think that's where polygamy obviously accelerates, and where it does take on this new demeanor of being the sealing ordinance, and that we're all one big giant family, and that the most elite, of course, they get all of the wives in order to create all of their progenitors. But that doesn't seem like it was so much in the mind of Joseph Smith in 1831. It just more seems like he was using biblical justifications to justify his adultery. I mean, there is a bit of a divide there. So let's kind of walk through the rest of the 1830s and get into the Missouri era, because there's a couple of highlights to hit on throughout that. And then once we get into the Nauvoo era.
Fanny Alger.
Yeah, let's talk about Fanny Alger a little bit. What's your take on that?
I believe it was an affair. There are a lot of people a lot of historians that do, and there's some that don't. You know, the historians for the church, you know, invariably believe that it wasn't an affair. But what we have,
and not only that it wasn't an affair, but that it was a holy sealing. So
right.
Therefore, it couldn't be an affair because it was done, you know, by the gift and power of God.
Yeah, the problem with the Fanny Alger incident is there's just lots of problems with it. What you have to do to believe that was a marriage was that Joseph had to have that revelation on polygamy. He had to have had a polygamy revelation, and that it was so secret and so and kept to only just a few people that even Brigham Young didn't know about it. David
or Oliver Cowdery didn't, because Brigham Young was a nobody in Kirtland.
Still, you know, he was one of the 12, and so you have Brigham Young didn't know about it. Oliver Cowdery didn't know about it. David Patton didn't know about it. Thomas Marsh didn't know about it. All of these the apostles didn't know anything about the polygamy revelation, but someone like, you know, Levi Hancock did. And so what we have is that the Mormon historians, they want to claim that Joseph had this revelation, but they have a problem because they want to date the return of the sealing power to 1836. And the best evidence that they can come up with was that the affair with Alger took place before that happened.
Yeah, like possibly even beginning in 32. I mean, much earlier.
Well, my best estimate is that I think that they're right. You know, Don Bradley did a lot of work on this, and I think that he's right that it happened in the early part of 1836, perhaps summer of 1835 or fall of 1835. But by 1836, it had blown up, and so. And then Joseph, Emma finds out about it, and she's very angry. And so Joseph makes a trip to Salem. He takes off, and then she writes him a letter to stay pure when he's gone. And I think he did that basically to get away from the situation. He went to Salem, and they looked for buried treasure in Salem. Then they came back, and Alger had left, but the problem with the whole timeline of the Fanny Alger thing is that you have to believe that Joseph did this without the sealing power, that he went ahead and he married the Fanny Alger. Brian Hale speaks about this, that he married Fanny Alger by his authority of the priesthood. But in later events and later, explanations about the sealing power, one can only perform a plural marriage with the sealing power. It couldn't be performed without it. And only one man at a time held the keys to it. So we have to believe that Joseph was experimenting with polygamy without, having the power really to do so. So,
which shouldn't be surprising. I mean, if we're establishing patterns here and seeing from prior to him becoming a religious leader, there were accusations flying around, and early on in his career, it shouldn't surprise us that he was committing adultery. He was having these affairs, and then he was later using post hoc rationalization in order to justify those. And historians are left trying to square those circles when they believe that there's the holy veneer to it. But we don't have to do that when we don't see the holy, the piety behind it. If we just posit the naturalistic explanations that Joseph Smith was very fascinated by women, the way that you introduced our conversation today, Johnny, it kind of takes the mystery out of it, and that he would use whatever necessary to hide it and to be able to do it.
Yeah. And it helps us to see how Joseph acted in later times and how he approached women especially during the Nauvoo era, because they left so many accounts about how Joseph approached them and what he did, that we can look back and see the Fanny Alger relationship took place in the same kind of way. This was a serving girl, a servant, or a maid that was hired to work in his home, and he has a relationship with her. The same as with so many other women that he came in contact with. It seems that Joseph was had a pattern. He would stay with families, and the people that he stayed with, those happened to turn out to be his wives. If we look at that, and we move on to Missouri, we have Lucinda Morgan. He went to stay with them in I believe the fall of 1837, and he has she turns up being his wife. There's an account by Sarah Pratt that Lucinda Morgan claimed that it was an affair, that she was his mistress for 4 years. That would be 1837 to 42. So, but Joseph has this pattern of choosing women and being with women that are close to him, that are friends of the family or in the home. So this pattern repeats itself or begins with Fanny Alger. We see Eliza Winters, then we see the Stoll girls. He was around them. If there's something there, and I don't have enough evidence to say either way, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But we know that he had the relationship with Fanny Alger, and there were accusations that he had tried to seduce Eliza Winters, a friend of his wife, Emma's. So the Fanny Alger thing, the reason that I believe that it's an affair is basically because of the testimony of Oliver Cowdery. And there's certain things about it that just don't add up. For example, the Mormon historians want us to believe that this was polygamy. I mean, that's what they affirm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, but when we have the trial of Oliver Cowdery and it's called an adultery scrape, we have all the witnesses present. And then we have Brigham Young there. And Brigham Young says later that he first learned about polygamy when he went to England, because there was a whole problem with polygamy over there. They had some kind of spiritual wife thing going on in England, and we don't know where it came from, but Joseph Fielding wrote about it. And there's some really interesting things with that. That I really don't want to go into. That's really a tangent I don't want to go into.
Right, but no, I mean, suffice it to say, though, spiritual wifery was a term that was coined long before Mormonism. I believe the initial coining of the term was in the 1780s or 90s, and it was just used to designate basically, cloisters that were practicing.
And many of the Cochranites became Mormons.
Yeah. The Cochranites, I think, are a fascinating group just because they are so close in predating Mormonism, from the 10s and 1820s. But spiritual wifery as a term was coined, in Europe itself, where there was a fair amount of sexual experimentation. And there were other cloisters like this that existed. And, oftentimes the equivocation is thrown out of the free love Oneida group. And of course, that came along, about 30, 40 years after Joseph Smith died. But there were these groups that were practicing some form of free love, non-monogamous free love. And yeah, it isn't crazy to think that Brigham Young was introduced to it in Europe, but that does kind of come into conflict with the whole Fanny Alger thing being an affair versus being a spiritual wife, or
But what's interesting about what Young said, though, was that he was converted to the doctrine in England before he heard it from Joseph Smith, and then he claims that he got back to Nauvoo. He came back from England, went to Nauvoo, and then Joseph Smith introduced him to it. So my whole point with that is that he was at the trial of Oliver Cowdery, and Joseph Smith got up and explained what he termed the girl business. So Brigham Young claims that he never heard about polygamy, so Joseph Smith could not have explained it as polygamy. So we have that off the table. So it was something else. The Fanny Alger affair was something else. That's my opinion. So moving on, we leave that behind, and we come to Missouri.
Yeah, Missouri is obviously a bit of a standalone piece of the Mormon puzzle because it was so brief in its time that Joseph Smith was there and that the church was headquartered there. And let's also be clear, because there was a fair amount of a fair contingency of the Mormons remained in Kirtland after, Joseph, Sidney Rigdon, and Brigham Young fled in the middle of the night. I guess it was just Joseph and Rigdon who fled at night. But they were only in Missouri from February or March of 38 to October, the end of October, early November of 38, when they were arrested and incarcerated. And there was so much chaos and so many pieces coming together, them trying to build multiple towns, resettlement efforts, planting crops, and, laying cornerstones, trying to build buildings haphazardly, that it doesn't seem like there was much time to focus on ecclesiastical matters so much because societal matters were taking the front stage. They were needing to focus on building buildings, not building relationships with other wives. So we do have this singular instance of Lucinda Morgan Pendleton out in Missouri, where when Joseph and Emma first got out to Missouri, they stayed with them, and that was it.
Lucinda Morgan Harris.
Harris, sorry, yeah, Pendleton was a different wife. My mistake, yeah, but Lucinda Morgan Harris.
But what's interesting about Lucinda Morgan Harris, it seems to be a repeat of the Fanny Alger incident, except in terms of age, she was a different age. She was much older. She was about 35, 36 years old, I believe, when Joseph Smith came in contact with her. And what happened is that in the fall of 1837, they moved down there to Missouri, and Joseph Smith visited down there, and he stayed with them. There's an interesting article by John E. Thompson on Lucinda Morgan, and he writes, Mrs. Harris was a married lady, a very great friend of mine. This is Sarah Pratt. When Joseph made his dastardly attempt on me, I went to Mrs. Harris to unbosom my grief to her. To my utter astonishment, she said, laughing heartily, "How foolish you are! Why, I am his mistress 4 years." And Thompson writes, it may be then that Joseph stayed with the Harrises during this visit to Far West in the fall of 1837, that he took Lucinda, now 36, to his bosom. That would certainly explain very well why Joseph felt secure enough with the Harrises to have his discussion with Cowdery in their house. So that's where he discussed the Fanny Alger thing with Cowdery, was in Missouri at the home of the Harrises. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of that. So
yeah, that's new on me. Interesting.
Yeah, so Cowdery learns this, and everything blows up with the Fanny Alger thing, but he's having a relationship with a married woman, Lucinda Harris. And Thompson then writes, at any rate, from that time, George W. Harris's star rapidly rose in Mormon circles. By February 24th, 1838, he was already a high priest and a member of the Far West High Council. At that meeting, a letter was read from Joseph Smith, which stated that he had again left Kirtland, Ohio for Far West, this time for good. George W. Harris was one of the 3 members of the council who spoke regarding the need to properly greet the prophet and his family when they arrived. He was appointed one of the 3 persons to make preparations to meet the prophet en route and welcome him. He carried these instructions out to the letter. The prophet noted that when he arrived in Far West on March 14th, we were immediately received under the hospitable roof of George W. Harris, who treated us with all kindness possible. One supposes that this hospitality extended to the continuation of the relationship with Lucinda. This time, though, the presence of the prophet's wife and children may have hampered them a little. Then there's an incident that takes place shortly after Joseph arrives, I believe in April of 1838, with a man named Aaron Lyon. Now, Aaron Lyon was the father of Windsor Lyon, who was the husband of Sylvia Sessions,
Oh, okay.
who became one of Joseph's other wives. But Aaron Lyon, he claimed that he had a revelation to marry this woman who was already married. And what he did is that he told her that her husband was dead, and then he proceeded to tell her that they needed to get married. Well, that blew up.
Wow, what a gentleman! My God.
So,
Yeah.
And so, but what's interesting is that at the trial of Aaron Lyon, Joseph Smith insinuated himself into the trial. Instead of presiding over the High Council like he was supposed to, he made himself the defender of Aaron Lyon. This is called The Notorious Case of Aaron Lyon by Thompson and Riggs. And they write, only 2 weeks before the Lyon case, Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated from the LDS Church. During his trial, a graphic picture was painted respecting what was termed the adultery scrape. Testifying against Cowdery, Joseph reportedly gave a history respecting the girl business to the assembled High Council members. It was not clear what spin Smith put on the story, as the specifics were omitted. As no mass apostasy followed, however, it can be assumed that whatever was necessary was said to mitigate the possible concerns of the Missouri faithful. As damaging as full disclosure of the Fanny Alger incident might have been to the progress of Mormonism in Missouri, Joseph Smith had only recently pushed the envelope even farther. Moving beyond polygamy, shortly after his arrival in Far West, he entered into a polyandrous relationship with his good friend George W. Harris's wife Lucinda, and we spoke about that. And then they go on. The problem that confronted Joseph in late April was this: his bosom friend Oliver Cowdery, while having been excommunicated only 2 weeks previously, was still in town and mad. Joseph said at Oliver's trial concerning the Fanny Alger episode in Kirtland, he entrusted him with many things. Besides that, Joseph had clandestinely entered yet another even more daring relationship since his move to Far West with Lucinda Morgan Harris. The Lyon case, which had triggered his polyandrous actions, was now coming to trial, and if his involvement with Lucinda was leaked simultaneously, it would have been a disaster. The saints might ask, what is the difference between Aaron Lyon and Joseph Smith? Both were seeking the favors of another man's wife. We conclude, therefore, that Joseph being paired with Lucinda's husband, George W. Harris, to defend Aaron Lyon before the High Council was a skillfully and successfully engineered effort to achieve damage control. So basically what happened is that Joseph and George W. Harris defended Aaron Lyon and his own polyandry case, where he went after the wife of another, because this is what Joseph was doing and didn't want this to get out of hand. So he broke all the rules in terms of his presiding over the High Council. He didn't preside over it. He became one of the defenders of the defendant in that case.
Yeah, he was partaking of the sacred ointment. Why not let one of his friends partake of it in order to keep it all under wraps? I mean, I don't necessarily see a contradiction there. I just see bros protecting bros. That's what it sounds like to me.
But we have all of this stuff going on in Missouri, and these types of things would continue on in Nauvoo. So, we go from Kirtland, and we have Joseph with Fanny Alger. We have him with other, linked to Eliza Winters. We have him confessing, of unchaste conversation in his youth. And it seems that he just had a fascination with women, and he wanted to get in relationships with them, and that's what he did. And so let's to Nauvoo, and then it just seems to escalate.
Well, let's go ahead and take a second here, because I want to share just my own brief opinions on what this is and the way to analyze this, right? So I don't have to view Joseph Smith in a way that I have to square Protestant ideas of sexuality and gender roles and everything with Joseph Smith's polyamory. And I think that's important, because there are people who do believe that he was the holy pious prophet and that he was only operating, almost begrudgingly practicing polygamy at the command of God. But when we do remove that, I don't think that anybody's character should be slain for wanting or acquiring multiple sexual partners. That fact alone is not a problem. It doesn't do anything about their character. What is worth examination is the way that they acquire those partners. And the way that Joseph Smith, the power dynamic that he created as the holy religious prophet of God, who was speaking of pure monogamy from the pulpit, yet behind closed doors marrying 30-plus wives, the hypocrisy and the lack of trustworthiness, and the protectionism that he created for just himself and his few friends that were practicing polygamy under the guise of this religious, I think what Sidney Rigdon called it, this religious garb. When we introduce those power dynamics and we introduce him as being this religious leader and coercing people by holding their eternity hostage in order to gain these wives, I think that's where we introduce some serious problems. And the decisions that Joseph Smith made in order to preserve that status, to preserve his ability to do that, are worth scrutiny. But the simple fact that he wanted to have sex with multiple people, he wanted to have multiple partners, that doesn't say anything about him as a human being. That just says that he likes to be intimate with people. There's nothing wrong with that. Where the problems are is when the way that he approached acquiring them. So with that preface, that's my own, personal opinions. With that preface in mind, Johnny, let's try and pick up in Nauvoo. Where do we approach this from?
We have a couple of precursors to Nauvoo that I want to talk about.
Yeah, please do.
Before we get there, because some really interesting things happened before that time. We have what's called the sealing power and the whole mystery surrounding that and how that developed, because there's two lines of thought. We have the line of thought which I subscribe to, which is that Joseph invented things as he went along. My friend Mark Clark wrote a book called Inventing Mormonism. And it's really a genius title, because it's basically what he did. He went along and invented things as he went and drew from, different religions and different backgrounds and different things that he learned and incorporated it into his life. And this plays into what, Dan Vogel espouses, that he was a pious fraud, that he was always trying to, have a religious angle to justify the things that he was doing, and whether he was sincere in himself in wanting to repent and wanting to be this great religious leader. The fact of the matter is that he did some things which we know of that upset people when they find out about him, the polygamy, the Danites, to name a couple. He had some things that he did that just seemed very melodramatic, and he was always self-aggrandizing himself. And his greatest theological invention was to make God a man. God's no different than us. And so this whole thing with the sealing power is a very interesting play on Joseph Smith becoming God to his people. Brigham Young once said, "I am your dictator and your God. Now, it would be wrong to worship me, but I am your God on earth." And Joseph Smith, and he learned this from Joseph Smith. There are certain things that Joseph Smith taught in terms of Elijah and the priesthood that are really important to understanding events that happened in Nauvoo. And Joseph Smith taught that Elijah, we all know what the church teaches, is that Elijah held the sealing keys. He was the last prophet to do so. And he came and appeared to Joseph in 1836 in the temple, and he gave him those sealing keys. Well, that's really not what happened. If you read the Revelations and you read what Joseph Smith wrote, what was the mission of Elijah in the early church, in the pre Kirtland temple days? That's an interesting thing that needs to be gone over if you're going to understand the sealing power and how it developed. When Joseph composed his history in 1839, he claimed that the angel Moroni had told him in 1823 Behold, I will reveal to you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. These words were later added to the Doctrine and Covenants with this header: words spoken by an angel to Joseph Smith on the evening of the 21st of September 1823. Now, those words were written in 1838, but at the time Joseph dictated these words for his history, he made some remarks about the priesthood, and he said, I testify of these things, that the coming of the Son of Man is nigh, even at your doors. If our souls and bodies are not looking forth for the coming of the Son of Man, and after we are dead, if we are not looking forth, etc., we shall be among those who are calling for the rocks to fall upon us, etc. The hearts of the children will have to be turned to the fathers, and the fathers to the children, living or dead, to prepare them for the coming of the Son of Man. If Elijah did not come, the whole earth would be smitten. Now, what's interesting is that Joseph had taught up to this time that the focus of the power of Elijah would be the hearts of the children being turned to the fathers and the fathers to the children. But this would not be accomplished through the sealing power. This would be accomplished by preaching the gospel.
So how exactly does that play into the sealing power specifically, and how that kind of played out to a person via, Joseph Smith having the sealing power and being able to proclaim that an adulterous marriage was indeed not adulterous?
Okay. Yes. Well, Joseph taught that in that quote that I gave you, that even after we are dead, if we are not looking forth, we shall be among those calling for the rocks to fall upon us. If Elijah didn't come, the whole earth would be smitten or wasted. He also taught another crucial concept at this time in relation to being sealed up to eternal life. He said, I will pray the Father, and he shall send you another comforter. There is one comforter, the Holy Ghost, and another comforter to abide with you forever, to teach, reach to things within the veil. Know that you are sealed. If you get it, it will stand by you forever. How is it obtained? Keep my commandments, and I will pray, etc. It is a privilege to view the Son of Man himself, and he dwelleth with you and shall be in you. His spirit shall be in you. I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you, abide with you forever, seal you up to eternal life. Yet a little while, and you shall see me no more, but ye see me. He that hath my commandment and keeps them, he it is that loveth me, etc. I will manifest myself to him. If he does not, he has not told the truth. I will put the promises in your hearts that will not leave you, that will seal you up. So what Joseph Smith was teaching here was what became known as calling and election.
Yes, the good old second anointing here.
And this is tied to Elijah in an interesting way, and the sealing power. What Joseph taught was that you live your life and you're righteous and you have the Spirit of God, and then Jesus will come to you himself. God will come to you, put the promises in your heart, and your calling and election would be made sure. So God would do this. He would choose you, and he would make your calling and election sure. Now, Joseph explained that this sealing up to eternal life was Jesus appearing to an individual and guaranteeing them their exaltation. They would know they were sealed. Jesus would put the promises in your hearts that would not leave you, that will seal you up. This was the Holy Spirit of promise that would abide with you forever. Obtaining this enables one to be sealed to eternal life. It was not a power granted to certain men to dispel as they saw fit. It was up to the Lord to give each person this opportunity. Joseph would later become as God to the people by usurping this power. This is what happened. We have to go back to 1833 to understand what Elijah's mission was and how Joseph changed it. He wrote this, Revelation in 1833. Be not afraid of your enemies, for I have decreed in my heart, saith the Lord, that I will prove you in all things, whether you will abide my covenant, even unto death, that you may be found worthy. For if you will not abide my covenant, you are not worthy of me. Therefore, renounce war and proclaim peace, and seek diligently to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers, and the hearts of the fathers to the children. And again, the hearts of the Jews unto the prophets, and the prophets unto the Jews, lest I come and smite the whole earth with a curse, and all flesh be consumed before me. That's D&C 98, 14 through 17. Do you see This is 1833, 3 years before he claims Elijah restored keys. What keys did Elijah restore? Turning the hearts of the fathers to the children. How is that to be done? Exactly the way that Joseph explained in 1833. Then he writes a letter 2 years later, and he says, their teachings, the elders, should be such as are calculated to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Therefore, first teach the parents, and then with their consent, let them persuade the children to embrace the gospel also. So Joseph writes that in a letter, and this aligns closely with the biblical account about the mission of John the Baptist. And he, John, will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So Elijah returning wouldn't be literal. It would be a person or persons raised up who preach with the spirit and power of Elijah. Joseph would later claim that John the Baptist had the spirit of Elias. But in the 1832 Evening and Morning Star, it was reported that Elijah and Elias were the same person, and hinted at a literal return of the Old Testament prophet. It reads, Elijah was translated to paradise in a chariot of fire, and Malachi says he shall return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And they quote Malachi. Now the Savior said he has come already, but the Jews knew it not, so he did not turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. And the following extract from Ecclesiasticus chapter 48 shows that Elijah, as he is called in Hebrew, will yet come and restore the tribes of Jacob. So there's no concept of sealing or welding people together into dispensations that go back to Adam. This was all invented by Joseph later. So what's going on here?
Yeah.
Well, Joseph Smith taught that Elijah was John the Baptist. The Elijah that appeared to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, when he translated the inspired version, he said that was John the Baptist and Moses that appeared to Jesus, not Elijah the prophet. But later he says that it was Elijah that appeared with them and restored the sealing keys to Jesus and the apostles. You see how it's changed.
No, okay, so my understanding here. Let me try and parrot this back, because I see the video and I see how animated and excited you are about this, because this obviously means something deeper to you than it is to me, or than I was able to pick up in your previous information. So essentially what you're saying is what Joseph claimed as far as the sealing powers that were supposedly restored in the Kirtland Temple, the week after the dedication ceremony when he and Oliver Cowdery were there. Those were the sealing power that was created at that time. Those keys, that is not what initially was thought to have been restored in the Kirtland Temple. The application or the claim that this sealing was restored in the temple is post hoc.
Ad hoc.
Yeah, post hoc.
Oh, post hoc, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so that's important, because if we're trying to square the circle of Joseph Smith's ability to seal people and seal families together in a celestial marriage, if he didn't actually, quote unquote, restore these keys in the Kirtland Temple in 1836, then that means it's going to be a later date when that first shows up, which is in 1840, 41, that he first claims that the sealing keys were restored in the Kirtland Temple?
What's interesting and why I bring this up is it throws the whole polygamy timeline out the window, okay? Because there was no sealing power. It wasn't even thought of yet. Joseph hadn't got there yet.
In 1836.
1840.
Okay, 1840 is when he first talked about having this sealing power.
Baptism for the dead, that's how he developed it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I really want to go through this because it's really interesting. Okay, in the inspired version, Joseph changed the New Testament to read, and after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, who asked him many questions concerning his sayings, and Jesus leadeth him up unto a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so white as no fuller on earth could whiten them, and there appeared to him Elias, Elijah with Moses, or in other words, John the Baptist with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Okay, remember the very first revelation about that I mentioned about Moroni appearing to Joseph Smith in 1823 and said that I will send you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah. He wrote that in 1838. Well, in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph added this text about Moroni, Elijah, and Elias to that revelation he had given in 1830. I don't know if I should quote this whole thing. Am I getting am I going too long here?
Well, I wonder if what you're talking about is a matter of splitting hairs, because what I mean by that is, if the power of sealing ordinances are conferred on the person with the priesthood, and it's deemed that this one person, whoever it is at the given time, Joseph Smith, of course, has the power of sealing ordinances. And that is merely one key that is nested inside the umbrella of the priesthood powers. Could it not just be that he may not, I'm just trying to devil's advocate this. Could it be said that, well, he didn't explicitly say the keys were restored at that time or the sealing ordinances were restored at the time, but the fullness of the priesthood was restored in 1836, delivered by Elijah. Therefore, at that time, he had the sealing keys conferred on him. Therefore, any marriages that were solemnized after that point were right within the ideas and ordinances of celestial marriage. Is that a hole in your argument?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Here's the thing, though, is that number one, let's read the vision. Let's read what the vision says. Elias appeared and committed the dispensation of the gospel of Abraham, saying that in us and all our seed, all generations after us should be blessed. After this vision had closed, another great and glorious vision burst upon us. For Elijah the prophet, who was taken to heaven without tasting death, stood before us and said, Behold, the time is fully come, which was spoken of by the mouth of Malachi, testifying that he should be sent before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest the whole earth be smitten with a curse. Therefore, the keys of this dispensation are committed into your hands, and by this you may know that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is near, even at the doors. What do we have here? We see Elijah and Elias as separate characters, and that Elijah was only committed with the keys of the power of turning the hearts of the children to the fathers. There was no, there's nothing about sealing there. And how was that to be done? Joseph had explained it in two revelations in 1833 and in a letter in 1835. So he explains this, and he says, but then he changes the mission of Elijah in 1835, and he adds it to the Doctrine and Covenants. He changes that revelation that I spoke about. And he writes this, and I'm going to read it. Behold, this is wisdom in me. Wherefore marvel not, for the hour cometh that I will drink of the fruit of the vine with you on the earth. And he adds all this. He had written that previously, and in 1835 he changes it to read this way. And with Moroni, whom I have sent unto you to reveal the book of Mormon, containing the fullness of my everlasting gospel, to whom I have committed the keys of the record of the stick of Ephraim, and also with Elias, to whom I have committed the keys of bringing to pass the restoration of all things, or the restorer of all things, spoken by the mouth of the holy prophets since the world began, concerning the last days, and also John, the son of Zacharias, which Zacharias Elias visited and gave promise that he should have a son, and his name should be John, and he should be filled with the spirit of Elias, which John I have sent unto you, my servants, Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery, to ordain you unto this first priesthood which you have received, that you might be called and ordained even as Aaron, and also Elijah, unto whom I have committed the keys of the power of turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the children to the fathers, that the whole earth may not be smitten with a curse, and also with Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, your fathers, by whom the promises remain, and also with Michael or Adam, the father of all, the prince of all, the ancient of days. So Joseph writes this long spiel in 1835, and then when the Kirtland temple is completed, they have this vision of Elijah appearing to them, and all of this stuff happens. So he has separated Elijah into two characters. He claimed that Elijah was John the Baptist, that it was John the Baptist that had the spirit of Elijah, and so John the Baptist appeared to Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration. But now John is Elias, not Elijah, and Elijah is his own character again. He's the prophet from the book of Malachi. And so, aside from how dishonest it was to change that whole revelation, Elijah now holds keys that needed to be literally restored. So there's nothing about sealing keys, only to restore the keys to give power to do what was described above, which was through teaching the gospel. I can't stress this enough. I think it's really important. Why? Because Joseph Smith invented the sealing power after he revealed baptism for the dead. And that plays into everything that happens in Nauvoo.
So that's the explain like I'm five version, is the quote unquote sealing power that Joseph Smith claimed to use to create, divinely sanctioned polygamy. That came way after he had multiple concubines, multiple affairs, multiple adulterous affairs. And that any exercise in trying to apply those sealing powers to the 1836 endowment that happened at that time, those are purely post hoc rationalizations in order to give that holy veneer on these revelations, or on these marriages, I mean.
And what's interesting is that Joseph said in 1838 that Moroni told him that Elijah would reveal the priesthood. And so that's interesting because, we have the priesthood being revealed supposedly by Peter, James, and John in 1829. But Joseph Smith just abandons them. He claims that Elijah had to restore the keys because Elijah was the last prophet to hold the sealing keys. But he wasn't. Peter, James, and John were. But he just abandons them. And he says that Elijah has to come and restore them. That doesn't make any sense, because they were already restored to Peter, James, and John, supposedly on the Mount of Transfiguration, as Joseph stated. But what happened to them? It's all about Elijah from now on. Why was it all about Elijah? And that's an interesting question.
So I don't know if we will get to it, because I'm looking at our time here, and I'm wanting to, instead of spending the rest of our time of this part one focused on the theology and the divine justifications for polygamy, I'd rather approach this in a way where we're talking about the people who were involved specifically and the way that events transpired throughout the beginning of Nauvoo, when they first started settling in Quincy and Commerce in 1839. Joseph gets sprung from jail, or he escapes jail with a little whiskey bribe to the guards, and they begin settling the Commerce and draining the swamp in earnest in 1839. And by 1842, he has 14 wives or something to that effect. He's organized this relief society, and a lot of events have kind of transpired altogether. Now, most paramount in all of this, we have the first Nauvoo, historically agreed polygamous marriage, and that's Louisa Beeman. And this was taken where Joseph Smith asked Louisa to be disguised in men's clothing, and they walked out to the grove. And I believe was it Joseph Bates Noble that performed this quote-unquote sealing ceremony. And this, according to you, Johnny, this sealing was brand spanking new. This was a whole new thing. So walk us through a little bit there of your take on the evolution of polygamy in the Nauvoo era.
Okay. The evolution of polygamy began with baptism for the dead. What happened is that Joseph Smith had these questions about his brother, Alvin, getting into the celestial kingdom, and he had always had them. And then a lady named Anne Booth had a vision in England, and she said she went to the spirit world and she saw people being baptized in the spirit world so that they could progress. Well, this got back. Brigham Young heard it. Wilford Woodruff heard it. And Brigham Young wrote the vision to his wife, and it got sent back to Nauvoo. And it was picked up there by a lot of people. It started being talked about, especially this man named Seymour Brunson, who was a member of the High Council, a friend of Joseph Smith's. But he died. And when Seymour Brunson died, Joseph preached at his funeral. And what happened is that this vision of Ann Booth had been discussed, and so they all said, well, Seymour Brunson was taken by the Lord so he could go preach in the spirit world, because Ann Booth said that she had seen David Patton there preaching in the spirit world, and that's where he went on his mission. And so all this stuff about the spirit world was getting bandied about in Nauvoo in 1840, and so Joseph Smith was shown the vision, and he said that there were some things wrong with it. He said that, okay, they can't baptize in the spirit world. That has to be done on earth. And so he claimed that Ann Booth's vision was okay, but she wasn't shown everything, or she got a little bit of it wrong. But it was a learning experience for her, something like that. And so then he says that what needs to be done is that people need to be baptized for the dead, and that this would be done through the sealing power of Elijah. This is where he comes up with and links Elijah and the priesthood to this ordinance of baptism for the dead. Okay, are you with me? And he writes all this stuff about it, and he develops it between 1840 and 1842. But during that period of time, Joseph is still carrying on with women. He has an affair with Mary Snyder, and her son Joseph Johnson witnesses him having intercourse with her at his house, and he spoke about this in 1850. There's no record that Joseph was ever sealed to this woman, ever had any marriage with her, and yet he's having intercourse with her. And Joseph Johnson said that, well, I knew he did it because Joseph Johnson had a trial. He had committed adultery. He took one of Lorenzo Snow's wives, and he had an adulterous affair with her, and they had a child together. So Lorenzo Snow gave the wife to Joseph Johnson. And when he was being tried for doing this, he mentioned that, well, I saw Joseph, he called it frigging. I was there when Joseph Smith was frigging my mother-in-law, and he did it, but I never plighted my faith on Joseph's transactions. But Joseph did it too. But he wasn't trying to justify it. He just said, we all make mistakes. So Joseph we have that account of Joseph doing that with Mary Snyder. He got involved with one of her friends, Sarah Cleveland. He got involved with all of these married women he started having relationships with. And the funny thing is that there's no documentation on any of them. We only have their accounts later that there was some kind of marriage ceremony that was performed. They call it sealing, but we just don't know because there's no documentation at all. And I have another problem with Louisa Beaman. I don't believe that marriage took place in 1841. It took place in 1842 because I just think Noble got the dates wrong. Because Joseph was only marrying other men's wives in that early period. It was a way for him to keep things secret. In a lot of cases, he could get the husbands to go along, and he could keep it all secret, and that's why he did it. But he repented of it, and we'll get into that later when we get into the Revelation 132. But so all of this is going on, and Joseph is developing the baptism for the dead doctrine, and he talks about sealing, and that there would be this great chain that would seal everybody from Adam, all the way down through the ages, and they would be one big family, and that's how the earth would not be totally wasted at the coming of Christ. Anything?
Yeah, I guess where there's so much bickering about the
not out at you. I'm sorry.
No. There's so much bickering about how many wives Joseph Smith apparently had, and Compton's book I think documents 34 of them. And that's kind of become the standard bearer. In Sacred Loneliness is become the standard bearer for a somewhat comprehensive historiography of Joseph's polygamy. But I also think that it's important to note that there are other historians who have posited as high as 60 or 80 wives, and the documentation for them at the time that it was written was already so obfuscated and so clandestine that it's hard to parse out the little documentation that does remain from that period that proves unequivocally that specific marriages were happening. But there were also, it's not a leap of logic to say that there were other things going on that didn't have the holy veneer, that there was, Nauvoo wasn't this perfect little pious town of Mormons with, squeaky clean streets. There were brothels that were in operation. There were saloons. There was a dark, seedy underbelly of Nauvoo where anybody who wanted to get whatever carnal satisfactions they desired, they could be satisfied somewhere in Nauvoo. And to claim that somehow, for some reason, that the adultery that, some religious leaders were practicing was somehow different substantively from the other lustful desires that other people were fulfilling, I think is only an exercise in semantics. What do you call it? Oh, this is not an affair. This is not two people engaging in consensual, intercourse. This is a holy sealing that is divinely sanctioned. I think that's an exercise in futility to posit the divine aspect within all of these. It's just people are getting together, people are bumping uglies, and people are always going to be doing that. And we run into conflicts when we try and justify it.
Yeah, I think though that we have to look at this from the viewpoint, and Dan Vogel, who I can't say enough good things about, always seems to come out with these little tidbits of things that make me make connections where I never saw connections before. I read his stuff, and he's just so insightful about certain things. But he claimed that part of Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, and I'm going to just skip ahead to it and mention this, was a repentance by Joseph. He had repented of his polyandry, and we can get into it later. But Joseph repented of his polyandry, and that's what part of DNC 132 was about. And then he says that was wrong, and going forward, I have to marry virgins, and so he started marrying single women. So we have this break in 1842 of Joseph not going after other men's wives anymore, but focusing on single women. And of course, the thing that happened in that period of time was the John C. Bennett scandal, where we're going to break and get into later. But up to this time, what Joseph is doing is that he's marrying, and I use that term loosely because no one knows what those relationships really were.
Right.
Because we don't have any ceremonies that were recorded. We don't know what the marriage ceremony was, if they had one. And Joseph, I think, was taking concubines at that time. Grant Palmer put this forward. I think it's a great insight by him. But what I think that Joseph was doing is he was likening himself to King David, and he was taking concubines, and he didn't need a ceremony. Although some of the women say there was a ceremony, so I'm not sure exactly what they did. But he marries other men's wives, and he's doing this from about the first of 1841 right up until the middle of 1842, and then he totally changes and he starts marrying single women. So the Louisa Beaman marriage didn't take place till 42 after he had changed his theology about it. But what Joseph was trying to do in this period of time was develop a theology where he could incorporate this idea of spiritual wives or polygamy and give it legitimacy. He brings the 12 come back to Nauvoo, and they find out that he's doing this. And in October, he gives this speech to them, to an assembled crowd. I believe it was in October of 1841. And he says, some sin is not sin. And you people are full of superstitions, and I'm going to break it down. And that's what I'm here to do. So this some sin is not sin thing creates a big stir among a lot of people. John C. Bennett, William Smith, and a few others. They go off on their own, maybe, we don't know, and start imitating what Joseph was doing with these married women. And that created a whole big problem in Nauvoo, and Joseph was kind of backed into a corner with it. The Relief Society was started up in 42, and his wife started investigating women, and all of this spiritual wife, what they were being called by Joseph. Bennett picked it up, and a lot of people picked it up, and so this spiritual wife thing was sweeping Nauvoo, and so they had this trial of John C. Bennett and all of this stuff, which came in May. And all of these, and it came out that Bennett and William Smith and a few others were having relations with all these women. And so the 12 is told by Joseph about that he's doing something in terms of concubinism or something like that. But I believe that Joseph justified it by claiming that he was like David. It's interesting that in 1842, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to William Clayton, and he signed it David, and he called Clayton his Jonathan. And Jonathan and David were two great friends of each other in the Bible. He calls himself David. In another instance, in 1840, when was it? 1843, maybe 44. No, in 1842. I'm sorry, when Sarah Pratt and Orson Pratt, and they had the whole Sarah Pratt scandal that came up, where she accused Joseph of trying to make her one of his spiritual wives. They had a trial for the Pratts. And in that trial, Brigham Young said, well, Orson Pratt's only problem is that he loved his wife more than he loved David, Joseph Smith.
Interesting.
So Brigham Young calls him David. And so there's all of these references to David, and Joseph Smith makes reference to himself as David throughout the Nauvoo period. So I believe that Joseph Smith thought that what he was doing was justified on the grounds that David did it.
Wow. Let's go ahead and cut off right here, because we're starting to get into the evolution of his theology and the break that was used to apply the term spiritual wifery to unapproved marriages, and then the new and everlasting covenant that were the sealed marriages that were approved of. And that's where we do see the beginning of the departure from, people like Bennett and William Smith away from the practices of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and the more, the divinely sanctioned versions of these marriages. And I mean, obviously we're going to try and include also this idea of concubines and whether there was documentation necessary to prove that these wives were being taken, or if they were just concubines that there was no documentation necessary, there was no sealing ceremony necessary, and that Joseph just viewed himself as a modern-day Solomon. So lots to get into, lots to break apart as we broach into the Bennett meltdown and discuss the fallout from that. As far as everything we've discussed today, Johnny, do you have any parting words you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah. I also want to talk about what Joseph did to the 12 and how he tried them to try to convince them that they should practice polygamy. He did some interesting things to them that I think is worth mentioning in the next part, because Joseph wanted to convince them to go down this path with them, and he was quite cruel sometimes in how he did that.
Very interesting. That's quite the teaser for part 2. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and we will pick up next time around with Johnny Stephenson. Johnny, if people want to find you on your social media presence or anywhere else, do you want to give out where people can get in touch with you?
Just go to Mormonite Musings.
Mormonite Musings blog. Awesome. Very cool. There will be a link for that in the show notes. Of course, listeners, thank you so much for tuning in with us, and I'll talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.